So I wanted to welcome you all today to the Graduate Center of Science Communications Academy Communicating Your Science webinar series. My name is Josephine Peterson. I am the project coordinator at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center's Illumination Space Hub. And our CUNY Illumination Space Hub is our collective space for science communication, outreach, and education. The link is there. I encourage you to check out some of the work we do. We really focus on educating, both young people as well as the communities around the Advanced Science Research Center and science professionals about how best to communicate science. We're really trying to broaden STEM research and a lot of the work that we do at the ASRC to the broader public. I did want to give a shout out also before we get started that the third annual symposium led by the students-led CUNY SciComm group is going to be holding their Communicating Your Science Symposium on June 9th. And applications are currently being accepted. And there will be a prize award to those who, it'll be a competition and there'll be a cash award for the best presentations. So feel free to use that QR code to find out more information about the symposium and how you can register and submit your science. So I am really excited to introduce to you our speaker today, Tom McNamara, who's a science media maker. Tom tackles complex topics with wide eyes, a sense of humor, and a meticulous devotion to facts. He is currently making a short film series for Brooklyn-based Pioneer Works Science Studios, reimagined Charles and Ray Eames' 1977 film, Powers of 10. Before that, he was the head of video at Popular Science for 5 years, where he discovered the lost first underwater film, animated an orchestra of hibernating animals, solved the mystery of the world's most sensuous lion, and made 2 videos about 2 different moles, very different moles. He also co-produced the Brain Scoop YouTube series at the Field Museum with science communicator Emily Grassley, where they told stories about collections and field research, including a mini-series filmed and edited over the course of a month on the Amazon rainforest. We're really excited to have Tom here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to him. There's a lot to cover. We're looking forward to the workshopping of a study later on as well. Tom?
Great. Thank you so much. And can you hear me? Can you hear me? Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hold on just 1 second. All righty. You should be seeing a Nautilus on the screen right now. Yep, great. Okay, let me just start that video. Great, thank you, Josephine. I'm Tom McNamara. I'm a science filmmaker. I'm super excited to be here. In addition to making science films, I also make like science infographics, science podcasts. But today I'm going to be focusing on like making visual media out of science. And so right now what you're seeing on screen is sort of like a highlight reel of stuff that I've made over the years. And today we're gonna be focusing on sort of like my process, but then get into, I've worked with scientists a lot over the years and just sort of some observations on what scientists are doing in media right now and like how you can, maybe think about making media, whether you're a student, faculty, researcher, or, in your research to come. So we can move on to the next slide. Great. So part 1 is going to be how I visualize science. Part 2, why you should always document your research, how to turn it into media and how to share it, how to make practical media kit for scientists. This is just sort of like a low budget way that you can sort of always have on hand, like how to be documenting your work. And then, like Josephine said, sort of a case study of turning research into media at the end. Great. So first off, just sort of like, how do I find stories? And I think that this might be interesting to, scientists and students alike, just in terms of like how do members of the media, come across your research and your work and what you're doing. Um, Often sort of in my process, I do like just sort of like thought experiments, word associations, and one that I stumbled upon, I don't know, like 5, 6, 7 years ago was, how many stories can I find on this theme? And so like on screen right now is like one of the videos I made about Nautiluses, just sort of like how many stories can I tell about the Nautilus? And so one actually took me to Brooklyn College, and I did a story with Jennifer Basil on her research with Nautiluses and sort of looking at ancient memory. And then part two of that story was, looking inside the Nautilus shell and looking at the fractal patterns inside. And it was sort of about fractals in nature, but then also like how fractals are used to do animation and like big budget movies. And then the third part, I was just like, how many stories can there be about the Nautilus? It's a pretty specific topic. But then I was like, oh, Jules Verne's Nautilus ship in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And so I remembered like that was one of the early silent films. And then I was like, okay, how did they develop the technology to film underwater? Because that was at that point sort of what was considered like the first underwater film. And then I found that the person who developed the technology, J.E. Williamson, he had sort of done a spec film before that, and it had been sort of lost to history. And through some research, I was able to uncover it. It was just essentially mislabeled in a Dutch archive. And I sort of told the story of the making of that film. And that's why you see sharks on screen there. And yes, those are horse legs. You should watch the video and find out why sharks and horses are hanging out together in 1916. And then I did the same thing with the mole, and mole was one that I've only done 2 videos on and would love to make more. And that took me to Dan McCluskey's lab in Staten Island, where I did a piece on his naked mole rat research. And then I did a very different mole in terms of the mole unit, which I remembered in chemistry from high school and college. And through that process, I learned that the international system of measurements was being redefined, and it took me to the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Maryland, and I documented the scientists that were helping to redefine the mole. And on the right here is Savalis Robb, a researcher who's holding a silicon sphere, which is one of the roundest objects known in the world, which was pretty cool to be around. And it was cool to be in an underground lab. And I'll get to sort of like the habitats of scientists later on and how I like being in them and documenting them. And so, sort of like more traditional ways of finding stories. I often like do like new ways of telling well-known stories. A lot like in working with science media, you sort of see like a cycle of news stories. And obviously there's always like innovative research that you can report on and do videos about. Oftentimes, I've done stories, like I said, like about the new mole unit, but I've also been like, what's a way that I could reimagine the telling of Sputnik 2 and Laika the Space Dog? And through that, there was some declassified Soviet like space data and documents, and it sort of painted more of a picture because it sort of had data in real time of what Laika the dog was experiencing in terms of like heart rate, stuff like that in the capsule. And then I was like, well, what if I put the story of Laika the dog in her own words? And so like I worked with a voice artist, and she did the voice of Laika. It was a fun project. And that was just sort of like a new way, again, of telling a well-known story. Likewise, in that second picture there's, this is sort of the equation that explains why a total solar eclipse can happen. And, I became sort of really interested in the coincidence of a total solar eclipse, the fact that like we are X distance from the moon and the moon is X distance from the sun. And then sort of just like the absolute certainty that this will happen, or at least for the next, I forget, like few billion years, until we drift sort of too far apart and we won't have a total solar eclipse anymore. But when I was researching that story, and this was in 2017 when the total solar eclipse was happening and you could see it in America at that point, I was just like, what's a new way of telling this story? And to that point, no one had really ever like done something on math and how like math can explain the total solar eclipse. So I was just like, that sounds cool. And also from my perspective, I always struggled with math. Similarly, when I was doing that mole unit story, like I struggled with chemistry, but like it was sort of like born out of like, I'd say like my insecurities with those topics, that I was just like, I really got to understand this and make sure that, as a reporter, I'm explaining it so that I understand it. So the fact that I understood it, I was just like, I think other folks are going to understand this too. And like, just through communications, through, people reaching out, like I've learned that like a lot of students have been watching like the total solar eclipse video as well as the mole unit video. So that's great. And then the lens effect is something, is a term that I've sort of like come up with in terms of like how I find my stories. And on the right, or you see the lion on your screen, and that's Fraser the sensuous lion. And I found Fraser the sensuous lion sort of like a long forgotten story in archives, about a lion that was retired from the circus and sired, I think, something like 35 plus cubs in his last days when he was like over the age of 20. And so working with like research scientists, we sort of explained how unlikely that was. And working with like just film archives, I was able to fill that story out more. And I would never would have found that story had I not started a series called Wild Lives, which was sort of pairing forgotten, maybe infamous sort of animal stories with science, which oftentimes you sort of like see like, oh, the telling of like a narrative story or the historical facts of something, but I teamed that traditional story with like science researchers who are doing everything from like how breeding is done in zoos, to how lions breed in the wild. And then, this one I think is particular interest to the audience here. How do I find stories? Oops, hold on a second. Like essentially like asking scientists. I was lucky enough to work at the Field Museum of Natural History, where I was working daily with scientists about communicating their research. So we were often like filming in the collections with them or going out into the field. And I've maintained those relationships over the years, and like every scientist I interview or work with, maybe like approach about a story, but I don't do anything with, like I keep in touch, and I often use them as like my sources. I found Dan McCluskey and his naked mole rats because he's the center photo there. I went to a science like event. I can't even remember where, but somewhere in the city. And he was speaking at it like years before I ever approached him about the story, about his research, because I knew that he was doing naked mole rat research. And because I saw him at that event, I was just like, oh, I really want to do something about that, put that in my pocket. And then years later, it just lined up. And then the photo of the snake there is a boomslang snake. And that was a story that I like uncovered at the Field Museum of a science curator there, Carl P. Schmidt, who in the 50s was bit by one, and he was not near any anti-venom at the time. And because he sort of knew the writing on the wall, he sort of documented what happened to him over the course of 24 hours. Unfortunately, he died, but like we have like his sort of like research notes as a living testament to what happens to a human when they're bitten by a snake. And then, I don't have an image for it, but press releases, science communication staff, that's like a huge source, definitely for my work. And I'd say for like science journalists in general. And we'll go to a AAAS site in a little bit. which is, oftentimes, especially like print science journalists, they're like looking at those news wires, and that's how they're finding your research to report on. And I've often found that like really strong visuals, whether it's me as a video journalist or someone as a print reporter, that's going to really be a great gateway into getting someone's attention to cover what you do. Great. And so like, how do I visualize science? And again, this is sort of about process, and I'll start this video clip here. This was for a story that I did on like what happens to your body when you die in space. And it was sort of based off of the moon landing and Nixon preparing a speech for if the astronauts didn't get off of the moon. And that's like something, in the National Archives. And it was sort of like building off of that idea, like what would have happened. And in a lot of the work that I do, and it's often like pulling from history, I'm really dependent on media archives. And so Internet Archive, archive.org, the Prelinger archive there is like a great source, especially for like, science footage ranging from like the early 1900s on through like the 1960s and 70s. NASA JPL is like an amazing resource for finding footage. Essentially, this video that I made here is all NASA JPL footage plus animation. The Wellcome Collection and Biodiversity Heritage Library are sort of examples of like science institutions or science related institutions that have just like a vast media archive of scientific work. And I'm always checking, their archives and their libraries and contacting researchers there for, stories that I might do in the future. And they've helped me essentially like visualize so many of my stories over the years. All right. And then let me start this video. Another thing is media from scientists. Examples are like the Schmidt Ocean Institute. On screen, you see an octopus behind the animated video, which I'll get to in a second. They're great at documenting what they do. Also, like, I know that they're very well funded, and they're also working with, underwater subs and underwater places and incredible creatures that no one gets to see, and they have that advantage in terms of being compelling science communicators. But they're really great in terms of like working with media members, getting their research out there and allowing it to be used in interesting ways. And then the animation here is from Harvard's Lichtman Lab, which was done in collaboration with Google Research. And it's a visualization of, I think, like 1 cubic millimeter of brain tissue sample that was taken from a living brain as a part of some epilepsy treatment. And through like, powerful microscopes, through, I think it was like hundreds of petabytes of data and processing, they've been able to like, down to like 500 microns, like visualize this 1 cubic millimeter of brain. And it's incredible looking footage. You're probably not seeing it at like high def right now. It's incredibly high def as well. But what was sort of interesting when I came across the footage, it had only been covered like once or twice. Like, like New Scientist did a story on it. It was someplace else, but like the story sort of like went unnoticed, which is crazy to me because the footage is so cool. I'm actually using it in an upcoming video, and I've been talking with and interviewing the researchers about how to sort of explain the context of it and use it in the scope of what I'm doing. And, equally important to, I think it's super important for scientists to be documenting their work. And oftentimes that leads me to stories. But I'm also shooting film, shooting photographs. And, I'll say like, I think it's hard to take a bad cheetah photograph. Um, I you know, like this one's pretty cool because when I was filming it, it stopped on top of this dead log, and you know what you don't see is like it peeing, but it did pee in this moment. And then another thing, like you know, cliff swallows. Those are really cool to film. But so much of a lot of my work has been uh, like what's invisible, like the invisible worlds of science. And you know, what you were seeing here on the video that was playing in the center is when I was at the NIST lab. And you know, it's tough to do things like in chemistry and physics in terms of visualizing them. Oftentimes I rely on animation, but you know, I've sort of concluded that like it's really cool to film in labs and where scientists work. And I think that's something, and we'll get to it in a little bit, that you as like science students, science communicators, scientists and researchers, you know, like where you work is a special place and not many people have access to it. And I've been doing this for like 10 or 15 years now, and I still get like so excited to go into a lab and interview a scientist. And I always try to like bring that energy to my videos. And you know, what might seem everyday to you because you're like working in a lab is like a really mysterious, cool place to the rest of the world. And so like if you're having trouble visualizing something, like always a go-to, and I'll get into it in a little bit, is just like showing where you work, showing where the research was done. All right, and so, you know, a thing that I do a lot is stop motion animation in my work. And I'm going to show you some references right now, and then some of my work. All right. So this is from Monty Python, and this is from a video that Terry Gilliam recorded in the, I think, 70s or 80s on how he animates. And it's just all like magazine cutouts, and it's paper layered on paper, and then stop motion, like every frame, him animating from that. Then here's Al Jarreau, who did a lot of like Sesame Street segments back in the 80s. And in a second, you'll see how both of these examples are sort of reimagined in my work. And I'll say that stop motion animation can be pretty time intensive, because it is. But it's fun to experiment with, and I encourage folks to look up that Terry Gilliam explainer, because he's like the master of it, and see how you can do it yourself. And then here's a film that I made called How Animals Hibernate, and you'll see how I implemented stop motion into my work.
In a snowy wood, in a hole, there sits a wood frog. Its heart is stopped and it's not breathing. As temperatures drop, the frog freezes. Its body fills with ice crystals. Every winter, like clockwork, the wood frog produces high concentrations of glucose and glycogen in its blood, and something akin to a syrupy antifreeze coats its cells. As a result, its vital organs are protected even though up to 2/3 of the water in the frog's body is ice. Just then, a painted turtle breathed through its butt in an ice-covered pond. Sort of. A hibernating turtle in water slows its metabolism.
You know, that was a story too, where it's an example of like animal hibernation stories have been told a million times. And it's not like I was talking about new research necessarily, but it was about how do I tell this story differently. And I've always loved Peter and the Wolf as a kid, and, you know, sort of each animal getting an instrument, and I was like, oh, I should give every hibernating animal an instrument. And then it was just like, you know, I do animation, like computer animation, graphic design, but not on that scale. And I was just like, oh, I should stop motion animation. It was very intensive, but it really paid off in the end. And it was sort of a mix of like interviewing scientists, and then it's a 5-minute video just sort of like synthesizing what they said to explain the hibernation process for the various animals that are in the video. Great. And then I'll show this one too. So what you're seeing on screen there is just like a way of visualizing climate for the next 100 years and predictions that me and the reporter that worked on the story were able to gather from interviews and research. And I was thinking, like, what's an impactful way to show climate change? I think putting it in the context of like where we can live in the next 100 years is interesting. And then showing just sort of like a map and covering it with, everything that we're going to encounter, from wildfires to rising water levels to, being covered in mosquitoes, I think was like an interesting way to talk about how the climate is changing and how it's going to affect how and where we can live in the future. Oh yeah, and then one other thing, like I built this shoebox diorama for the background of the lions for my Fraser the Sensuous Lion story. So I go all out with this stuff. Here I'm gonna get into some sort of like visualization techniques that I often encounter or do. The backdrop picture here is in a NIST lab, National Institute of Standards and Technology, for that mole video that I was referencing before. And it's actually like an example of a storyboard that I will do. And so sometimes I'll draw my storyboards, or if I'm working with footage, I'll like print out, or I'll like snap a picture with my phone and sort of draw on it. And sometimes I'm working with animators, and I'll provide like those drawings as examples of like, here's what I'm thinking of how to visualize this science. And like I said, like when you're doing stuff that is just like number-based, often invisible, you really have to rely on like creative techniques. And speaking of that, so there's a big thing, especially in like explainer videos that you'll see on Vox, places like that, where like everything that's said, there's a representative or corresponding image or animation movement or whatever. It can be an attention grabbing way of like making films just in general, or like videos or explainer videos in general, but it can be like time consuming, resource intensive, all these things. So when I was making videos about the naked mole rat, the mole unit, I was like, how can I almost have like a visual refrain that I can return to throughout the piece, maybe sort of have my big questions asked in these moments, give the piece a little breath. And when I was thinking about that, I thought of like one of my favorite science films of all time, which is A Brief History of Time, which I'll show like the clip from.
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did the universe have a beginning, and if so, what happened before then? Where did the universe come from, and where is it going?
And so, half like the film is these sort of meditative moments where like spaces, you're sort of in space, or like there's objects floating in space. And it really, I think it allows a viewer to not be like, especially like in the age of TikTok and everything, where everything's flashing at us or there's always text on screen. It's a moment for reflecting, especially if you're trying to like explain a big concept. It's important to be able to show that visually, but it's also important to be able to allow someone to think about what they're hearing. And I'll show you how I did that in the mole unit space out.
chemists Bob Vaki and Savelis Robb at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Well, them and a whole international team of scientists. But before we get lost in all the zeros of old and new moles, let's take a step back. What is a mole?
So throughout that piece, and you'll see that it started sort of like built out of this storyboard that I have here. It's a 10-minute explainer just sort of like on the history of the mole and why it's being redefined and what the mole unit is used for. So it's like 10 minutes long. And the piece really benefits, and you can look it up from those moments. And I return to that, like I said, sort of like a song, like a refrain, where like every sort of big question or summarizing sort of moment in the piece is set to the numbers of the mole sort of flying on screen. Similarly, when I was doing that story, I was just like, this is just all numbers, and there's only so much lab equipment that I can show. So like, how can I visualize this?
Total 8. The guards, for instance, by the gate
I'll
must
let you watch
always
this.
number exactly 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In my castle in back of me are 8 windows you can see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
So that's Sesame Street classic little vignette, which I loved as a kid, and I still love them to this day. And basically, it just made me think of that and Schoolhouse Rocks, and like, how can I make the like numbers dance on screen? And so I'll show you how I did that.
That's a little more than 600 billion trillion. Said another way, 6.0221407 times 10 to the 23rd. Here's the thing. That number is the redefined mole. Oh yeah, and while the mole is a number, it's really a unit of measurement. You see, in 1971, it joined the kilogram, the second, the meter.
And then lastly, if you are making media for yourself, or if you're working with a journalist, I love filming sort of scientists like in their natural habitat. And sometimes it can be easier if you're out in the field doing stuff. Like I'm working with some Columbia Climate School scientists, and I'll be like in kayaks with them, and like that's sort of like a cinematic cool space to film them. But if you're a lab research scientist, sometimes it can be harder to try and figure out how to visualize that. And so here is an example of just showing a scientist where they work and live.
In physics, there's somewhere an equation that relates Avogadro's constant and Planck's constant together. So if you know one, you know the other. But the interesting thing is, this experiment that measured Avogadro's constant came more out of chemistry, and the experiment that measures Planck's constant came more out of physics. This is a miracle.
So that's a kibble balance behind Stefan Schlaminger at National Institute of Standards. And like, I just really love being in that lab, or like when I worked at the Field Museum, showing the scientists in their collection spaces. Like, even if you're working with like a journalist or an outside person, like be thinking sort of creatively about where you are, and maybe like don't just take them to your like tiny office if you're trying to do an interview. Sometimes it can be hard to schedule, but it's more impactful. And I think that an audience buys into it more because they're seeing something that they don't get to see every day. Okay, great. So like, I'm going to start playing this video while I talk. Why you should document your research. I first and foremost sort of come at this as someone who's worked with scientists a lot, and someone who is really obsessed with like science history films and sort of the history of science, like scientific filmmaking. And what you're seeing on screen, that's a photo in the background of Akeley, who, famous taxidermist. He invented a camera to sort of help his process along. His camera was used like in Hollywood, like, interesting, complicated person, definitely. And then like the footage that you've been seeing is like a volcanology reel from the Field Museum in the 1950s. You saw a first eclipse, I think, which was filmed in 1900 or 1901. This is Middlebury students. This is just undergrads messing around in a lab. I don't know, some of it looks maybe dangerous. I have no clue, but it's charming footage, definitely. And then coming up here are basket island gulls, which are like off the coast of Ireland, which I think is just really cool footage. Here's footage from Bell Labs, which is pretty awesome. And I'll skip ahead. And then this is Grace Hopper, like a famous early computer programmer. She also worked for the military, and this is footage of her explaining the distance of a nanosecond. And she was sort of tired of people in the military coming up to her and being like, why is our communication take so long? And so she finally figured out a way to visualize that and explain it. So she was always handing out, I forget how long it is, but like these like wire cables, and she was just like, this is why it takes so long, which I think is pretty funny. All right. Oh yeah, and then this is just like something for a little levity, and it's, I don't know, kind of insane. So in 1971, Stanford students performed the cellular process of protein synthesis, and it's introduced by Nobel Prize winning chemist Paul Berg, and he refers to it as a happening. And so I'm going to play that, and this one has audio.
Only rarely is there an opportunity to participate in a molecular happening. You're going to have that opportunity, for this film attempts to portray symbolically, yet in a dynamic and joyful way, one of nature's fundamental processes, the linking together of amino acids to form a protein.
Was brillig in the slithy 30S ribosome did gyre and gimble in the wabe. 30S ribosome.
So that actually goes on for 20 minutes, and which is pretty amazing. Which, you know, my two takeaways from that was like, school seems a lot easier and less stressful back in the 1970s, and also it's a pretty kick-ass psychedelic soundtrack if you listen to it. So I would look that up and actually watch more. It's hysterical, but it's also an interesting way of science communication. And scientists working with artists is a cool thing.
Only rarely.
Great. And so now is like how to turn your research into media. You know, I highlight the word here, broader impact. Which is, you know, definitely associated with like NSF grants and how you can communicate your science to a broader public, the public in general. And, you know, like this is really important. And, you know, having worked with like field museum scientists who have like won grants, you definitely see sort of like a trend in science right now and science research funding. Like if you have like an interesting media component to what you're doing, and if you're thinking about that, you know, and obviously the science is the most important part, but if you're thinking about interesting ways to visualize and document what you do, you know, I've seen like definitely those scientists get their research funded. And that's just like an observation as someone who's like covered science in the media as well as like worked with scientists on these pitches. And that can be sometimes a difficult ask, definitely, of scientists. Like, you know, you're an expert in your field. You don't necessarily have time or maybe the expertise in filming, photographing, making infographics, design, all these things. Definitely, you know, I know budgets are small. There are options to work with outside media makers. At the same time, you know, you sort of got to work with what you got. So like, some things I've seen and incorporated into my work, but from scientists, are like lab time lapses, nature camera traps, the data visualizations that accompany your papers. And like I sort of like have been hitting on, like field photos and videos, yes, but also like lab photos and videos, and I'll show you why in a second. Whoops. So I'm going to click here on from AAAS Eureka Alert, and this is representative of a page where your research will go when media members are like looking at what you're doing. A lot of news wires and science organizations, it will end up on a page like this. And I'll just scroll through it for a second. This is, recent as of today. And you can sort of see how like, your research and like your photos are placed, consciously and for a reason throughout your paper, wherever you publish it. But then you sort of look at how like your photos get pulled apart. And one thing that I've always sort of said is like, make sure in your paper that like your lead image that goes along with what you're publishing is a compelling one, because that will be the one that's pulled for first and can be something that grabs someone's attention, as opposed to like, cool voles, I'm interested. A headshot, less so. I was scrolling through this today and like I came across like this infographic, which I thought was like really, I see more of it now, but you don't often see like an interesting infographic to accompany some research. And as a person who's working in the media, like I find those things compelling because I'm like, oh, visuals to work with. But then I'm also like, oh, this is a person or scientist that's like visual thinking, and I'm like, they could be fun to collaborate with, or they might sort of get where I'm coming from when I approach them about a story. And then this is sort of an example of like working with your comms team and working with the press people that like, if you're working with a lab or a university or a museum, you have access to in terms of them helping you spread what you do. And when I was doing the new mole unit video, the communications person at NIST did this incredible website, and you should look this up later, just sort of going through all of the units and why they're being redefined. And it's like exhaustive, but it's interesting. There are videos. It's really meant for members of the public. And I just love seeing research put into this context. Because also like when I was reporting my piece, like I did my interviews, but this was great to sort of return to, because it's, meant for members of the public, whether I was like fact checking or trying to add something new to my piece. This was a great resource. And when I said like document what you do, always be documenting. This is Seeker, which is part of The Verge, and this is their Instagram. And this is like a big gateway for any like science medias through like their Twitter handle, Instagram. Like not everyone's checking these websites every day, but they do follow them because of cool visuals. And like everything that I'm scrolling through here is footage from scientists. And a lot of the stuff is just sort of like lab B-roll. And so like when I've worked with scientists, I've set up like GoPro cameras in the corner of the lab just to have like time lapses of them working. And like, if you have that footage, a place like Seeker or The Verge is gonna be that much more likely to be like, oh, there's like cool footage associated with this thing. I'm gonna cover it because, visuals sell. And then I'm just showing this because it's one of my favorite follows on Instagram, Voyager's Wolf Project. You should just follow it too for cool wolf and animal footage. It's also from Minnesota, where I'm from, so I have a soft spot for it. And then the perception senses, which is from Anil Seth, which is he's a neuroscientist, and this is part of like his new research. This is just like an incredibly beautiful site, and part of the site is public engaging with his research and him sourcing sort of public information. But this is obviously funded by a ton of grants, but I can see in part why something like this was funded, because it had like an interesting media strategy along with it. So I'll sort of like go through this quickly. how to turn your research into media and share it. I'll show you Particle Clara on TikTok. What's really cool is like this isn't green screened. You see a lot of media like this on Instagram or TikTok and it's green screened. You know, she's a scientist at CERN and she's showing people CERN, which is obviously like an incredibly cool place. But it, you know, like a lot of the settings are very lab-like, and like what, you know, this is just to sort of hit home, like even your lab is an interesting place. And then there's also Pond Life on Instagram. Sally Waring I've worked with her in the past. She's very cool. This is like a really simple project, something that you can do with your research. Like what is sort of like one thing you can pull from what you do? And, you know, she has like awesome microscopic footage of life in ponds. And that's a part of her research. And most of what she posts is just that footage raw, and she'll have like a little explanation. And she's gotten to do like science video series as a result of it. It's very cool. Then check out Ant Lab on YouTube. It's an example of just like a scientist having access to something that like maybe not a lot of folks have access to. It's a good watch. All right, so here's the simple media kit. And this is, I'm coming at it from the perspective of like, we all have smartphones, or most of us do. Here are some things that you can sort of add to your smartphone kit to, you know, add to what you can document as a scientist or a student. A clip-on macro lens is great. I bought my niece one for Christmas, and she's been making lots of cool films with it herself. A GoPro for time lapses. Like anywhere that you can do a time lapse, like as a member of the media, like I'm interested in that. And like I sort of showed with Seeker, like that footage is being used. A tripod helps, like a steady camera. A phone gimbal, which is like a moving sort of steady cam. You move it around like that, attach your phone to it, or like a gimbal camera, which like, you know, those run, I think like $300 now, and they shoot in 4K and they have audio components. It's like an interesting option, I think. It's not too expensive, but it is expensive. And then, you know, a big one is like a microscope adapter, or like I've seen people with binoculars like have adapters like attached there. An overhead mount, because, you know, if you think about like a lot of videos you see on the internet, it's like hands opening stuff from an overhead shot. Similarly, like a lot of science is just sort of like at a table, you know, perspective down. It's great to have something that you can sort of film your work from above. Lighting, a lot of labs I've worked in, you just sort of light themselves, but like that's an option. There are affordable like little lighting gear like that. Audio, like if you're working, you know, if you're recording like, you know, bird sounds, you've got great audio equipment. This is an example of you can get adapters for your phones, but sometimes they're almost as much as just having like an affordable like audio recorder that you would like maybe use for podcasting or whatever. And then editing device, DaVinci Resolve is a free service. It's a free editing software that, you know, is consumer friendly and has a lot of power behind. It's not as good as like Premiere or Adobe that I'm working on, but it's interesting. It's a good free option. Also, if you're students or if you're working with a university and you're interested in it, Adobe has like great student rates. So I would seek that out. Because, you know, like if you're interested in that type of, if you're interested in working with media, I think it's always best to sort of like, and you have like some discounts, student discounts. I think lynda.com, I'm not sure if that still exists, but like there are lots of free tutorials on how to teach yourself sort of basic editing that are out there. Great. And then just to sort of get to the Q&A brainstorm as we wrap up, the one, I got some submissions on like how I would come at a story like visually as a video maker. And the one that I selected was from the Nee Meister lab, using LiDAR technology to detect forest carbon storage. And I love stories about trees. I think it's sort of like an underreported topic, and I think it's terribly interesting, especially as it relates to climate change. And so, you know, one way into like storytelling about trees in general is this like question I came across. Is, hold on one second. You know, so like, what are there more of? Stars in the Milky Way, neurons in the human brain, or trees on Earth? And, you know, maybe this audience knows that answer, but it's 100 to 400 billion for the Milky Way. Could be more. It's hard to tell. Neurons in the human brain is 86 billion. And then trees on Earth is 3 trillion. And so that just sort of gives you like the scope and magnitude of like how many trees there are. And, you know, I just sort of say that as like an interesting trick or way into a story. And then sort of like understanding what LiDAR technology is, you know, I think about, you know, like this image that I pulled of a LiDAR visualization, and I put in my note on screen here, ground view. If a tree falls in a forest, how much carbon storage is lost? As someone who would want to incorporate this type of research into a story that I'm making, I'd come at it with like a question like that. And if I was visualizing it, you know, I'm looking at this static image here, like if I were to start to take away some of these trees, I would come up with a way to sort of animate on screen as well, like what is the carbon being lost, or was the carbon storage capacity being lost as a result of losing this tree? An aerial view look, which I know, you know, I wasn't sure if like the footage being documented was sort of ground view or aerial. It made me think of this project that someone did where they stitched together 200,000 Google images documenting the border between the US and Mexico. I'll give you a sense of what that looks like. And this was done more as like an art project, but it shows you sort of the like power of scale and scope when you're looking at things. And even if you have like just images, you can stitch them together and animate them in interesting ways. Oops, not quite done yet. You know, another thing that I was thinking of, and when I was like looking this up, it took me to Kew Gardens page, and they do great videos, by the way. But this LiDAR scan of a redwood, which, you know, just as like, you know, is beautiful, it's interesting. It made me think sort of Sally Waring's Pond Life project, where she's just posting that type of just like microscopic footage of her research, you know, like she did it once like daily or weekly. Like this could be something that a lab could do. Like they have this interesting media, post like different trees, the LiDAR scans of them, and sort of, you know, explain the science of what they're seeing, or the carbon storage capacity, or the cycles sort of in a given day, month, year of carbon storage. It's a very like image first way, and this is cool footage. And as if I came across this, one, I know that it would get like attention if this sort of project was done. And if I came across, I'd be like, oh, cool, how can I do a story about this? And then, you know, similarly, like this is from Wired. And this is just someone putting LiDAR research, you know, maybe more into like a newsy angle, you know, logging the Amazon, the race to map Earth's threatened rainforests. Is just a, you know, sometimes research can be really targeted and narrow and in a silo. And, you know, sometimes I haven't seen too much like when researchers like maybe have the opportunity, and this is, I know, asking a lot, or maybe like, you know, you can sort of think about like, what would be like, you know, thinking about like, how would someone cover this, or how could I better communicate this, or how could I get people in the public interested in what I do? And, you know, just sort of like layering this type of headline or this type of question onto your research, you know, can make it like more appealing. And like, you know, research is great and it's going into the scientific record, but also like I come from the perspective of like science research should be for everyone. And that's sort of like my part in the sort of science story, is like trying to communicate some of that to a wider audience. And yeah, I think that's sort of coming to a close. I was able to speed it up at the end and get there. So there's not a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to hang around if folks have questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really great webinar. I think we all learned a lot. I did have a question before lots of people jump off. Will you be able to send us kind of a list of the links that you presented today so that we can include that when we put the video up on YouTube?
Oh yeah, totally. I'll give you the slideshow.
Okay, perfect. So we will get the YouTube video or this on our YouTube channel with the captions and with Tom's talk. And we will get the presentation out to those who are interested as well. I want to thank everybody for coming today to our webinar. And please stay tuned for next month's webinar. We'll be sending out information about it soon. It'll be the last Friday in February as well. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Tom.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Seeing more of your work. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.